Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. I finally got my hands on the Retroid Pocket Flip. Now this is a review unit that was sent to me earlier, but there was an issue with the mail, and so it actually came at the same time as the other two Retroid Pocket Flips that I ordered for myself. Now because this arrived just yesterday, I'm not going to do a full review. That's going to take me like a week or so of work, but we are going to do a quick impressions video here today. Now when I say quick, I don't mean it's going to be a short video, but I do mean that I will reserve some things for the review video here in about a week or so. And so when it comes to a deeper dive in regards to things like performance or just long-term use, yeah, we'll wait for that for later. But as it stands, even after a day of using this, I've come up with a bunch of ideas, and so we're going to do something special here, and instead of actually just going through the usual process, what I'm really going to do is address some of the findings and thoughts that I've had as I was testing it. And I'm hoping that some of these unique discoveries are exactly the questions that you have regarding the Retroid Pocket Flip. So let's go ahead and jump into the video and talk about my experience here with the Retroid Pocket Flip over the past 24 hours. Okay, to set the stage, I want to talk about the price first. And my first note here is that the prices do not include shipping or any sort of applicable taxes depending on where you live. Now, there are 5 available colors, and the top 2 here, the Sport Red and the Watermelon, these two cost $164. And that's $5 more than the other 3 colors, which are going to start at $159. Also, you can see the little pre-order thing right here, but they're not actually up for pre-order now, they're just available for sale. Now, when I emailed Retroid and said, hey, I finally got my shipment, I'm going to work on a quick impressions video, they ended up writing back and saying, hey, here's a $10 off code that you can share with your audience. And so if you are interested in picking one of these up, you can use this code right here to get $10 off the Retroid Pocket Flip. Bear in mind, this is limited to just 1,000 units, but I don't think there's any way I'm going to actually sell that many. But either way, this is the code, and I'll have it linked down in the description below. And as a quick disclaimer here, this video is not sponsored by Retroid or anything. Yes, they did send me that early review unit in the Sport Red color, but other than that, everything I've paid for on my own. Anyway, back to the storefront here, you can see they also have a new grip as well as a case for the Retroid Pocket Flip. And I ended up buying these too, so let's do a quick test of these as well. The grip itself is kind of unique. It basically will secure itself into place by using these screw holes. And I have to admit, even though it's kind of neat, it's not a very snug fit. And this is a similar issue I had with the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus grips. They definitely improve the ergonomics by a little bit, especially when you're actually trying to use the triggers, but it also feels kind of loose here in the case. In fact, I can pull it out very, very easily. And so this isn't something that you could actually put on the device and just leave there. I think it would fall off all the time. Now, what I found interesting about the case is that the case itself is made to be used with the grip. And it's a perfect fit if you do that, but if you were to just throw the Retroid Pocket Flip inside without the grip, it would just kind of slosh all over. And there's a lot of space in here, so you could put a charging cable, even a charging brick, and maybe some SD cards, and you still have plenty of space. And overall, I'd say the case is okay for the price that you're going to be paying, but it is just kind of a cheap generic hard shell case. So if anything, if you want to use the grip and then keep it portable, this might be a good solution right here to just kind of have everything all at once. And I don't know about you, but the way I think about clamshells is that they have a case of their own. That's kind of the whole point of the form factor, in that it protects the screens and the buttons. So personally, even though I did buy that case and grip, I don't think I'm going to be using them very much. And part of that has to do with how nice and small the Retroid Pocket Flip is on its own, which actually is the subject of our next section here. And that is that I was surprised by how small the Retroid Pocket Flip actually was. Before we get to that, let me show you what's going to be inside the box here. To start, we have this little cheat sheet here, which will show us the buttons as well as the specs on the device itself. Also inside, we will get a microfiber cloth, the first time I've seen this from Retroid, and then a USB charging cable. And that's really it inside the box, so let's get to the device itself. And this is the review unit one right here, so that's the Sport Red Limited Edition. And these are actually numbered. I got a random number here of 159. And we'll talk about the colors and the glossiness in a minute, but I really want to focus here on the size. And yeah, I was really surprised at just how small and compact it actually felt in the hand. In fact, let's do a quick comparison against some other clamshell devices. And as you can see here, many of these are actually quite a bit larger than the Retroid Pocket Flip, at least when looking head on. A good example would be the Powkiddy X18S, which has the exact same chip between the two. But as you can see, the Retroid Pocket Flip is quite a bit more narrow and shorter. The major difference here is it's a little bit thicker at the base, but then a lot thicker when you get to those flared shoulders and triggers. Now when we compare it against the DS Lite, you can see it's very similar in overall size, other than that thickness, especially in these triggers. The Flip also has a hinge that extends past the shell, which does make it bigger in that regard too. So I guess the way I see it is that the size here is comparable to the others. In some ways it does feel smaller just because of the overall height and width, but it is thicker than the others. In fact, it has kind of a bubbly feel to it just with that overall thickness. And that thickness does give me a bit of a unique feeling. I would say that it is pretty easy to just kind of walk around and hold it, but once you do slide it into your pocket, you will immediately feel that bulk. You know, with other handhelds, I'm able to say, oh, this feels a little bit like a thicker phone. This kind of feels like 2 or 3 phones combined altogether. So it is a bit of a strange viewpoint compared to the other regular handhelds, because from many perspectives, it does seem to be quite a bit smaller than others. And a lot of that comes down to the unique form factor of clamshells, especially when compared to those that are more of that candy bar shape. On the one hand, when you're just porting it around, yeah, it feels a lot smaller than something like the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus. But when you open it up, it's a totally different story. For example, it has the exact same screen and chip inside, but you're working with a lot more handheld real estate when you actually open it up. And so I can see the appeal of clamshells in this regard. When you close it up, it's actually a little bit smaller in width than something like the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus. And same story with the Anbernic RG405M, which is an insanely compact little handheld. But when you open it up, the feel between the two is a night and day difference. You've got more than enough room here on the bottom when you're actually using the controls, and you've also got space for this 4.7-inch widescreen display. And so really it's almost like the best of both worlds. And so if we're talking about portability, as long as you don't mind the thickness of the Retroid Pocket Flip, then this thing is pretty dang small. It's really going to come down to you and how you're going to carry around your handheld device, and whether or not that thickness is going to become a factor for you. Because yes, when it comes to that dimension, sure, the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus is miles better, but when you're just holding them in the hand, to me, the Retroid Pocket Flip feels a lot smaller than the 3 Plus. Which is crazy to me because I love the size of the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus. The way I see it, I imagine myself just grabbing the Retroid Pocket Flip at the same time as I grab my phone when I'm running around doing an errand. Yes, it's another thing to carry around, but it doesn't seem that much bigger than the phone I'm already carrying. Now, if you're a numbers kind of person, let me give you some of those so you can get an idea of the thickness. We're looking at about 25.5 millimeters when it comes to the thinner edge. And if we look at the thickest point here around the triggers, we're looking at a little bit less than 31 millimeters. And if you compare that to something like the new Nintendo 3DS, you can see this one's about 2/3 of that thickness. Now let's talk about weight. The Retroid Pocket Flip is 270 grams. If we compare that to the new Nintendo 3DS, you can see that the Retroid Pocket Flip is about 17 grams heavier. And that also makes it quite a bit heavier than other handheld devices like the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus, as well as the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, and it's just a little bit heavier than the RG405M, which is kind of surprising given the fact that this one's made out of aluminum. All things considered, if I had to describe how it feels to carry around the Retroid Pocket Flip, I think my best description here is that this is a handheld that is very easy to carry around, but it's not necessarily something that I would probably want to throw in my pocket for long-term use. Instead, I wouldn't mind throwing it around in like a bag because I feel like it's going to be well protected. Or it's something that you could slip into your desk drawer or maybe slide it into the door of your car. Either way, yes, I was surprised at how small it was, I just wish it wasn't so thick. Now, the other thing that really concerned me about the Retroid Pocket Flip was the hinge. And that's what we're going to talk about in this next segment here. When it comes down to it, I think the hinge is nice and sturdy, but it does have a limited range in terms of just opening it up. When you open the device up, it's going to go to one specific angle, and it'll stop right there. There's no click halfway or anything else like that. It literally just goes from close to open. But I did find that the widest angle on the Retroid Pocket Flip is a little bit less wide than other handhelds. For example, all the Nintendo handhelds that I own open up to a wider angle than the Flip. The angle I found to be most similar to it was actually from the Powkiddy X18S, and this was also a handheld I always wished opened up a little bit more. Now, the way this mechanism works is that they have these two plastic parts right here at the edge of the hinge. And so when you open it up, these two things are going to act like stoppers. And I think these plastic pieces do their job, but all the same, I'm a little bit worried about them breaking if someone was to abuse them. Either way, I don't see myself putting that much pressure onto the device, and really the motion here feels pretty fluid and kind of satisfying too. And it turns out I don't really have any worries about the hinge at all. It doesn't feel loose in any sort of way. In fact, I can't really make it budge at all. Now, all three models have a similar experience. After all, they have the same kind of hinge design, but I did find that the glossy red one opens up more easily than the other two. And this likely has to do with the type of plastic that they're using for each of these materials. Either way, when it comes to the sturdiness of the hinge overall, all my fears have basically gone away. Even though they do kind of look like toys, they feel really solidly made. Now, although I was a little bit worried about the Flip not opening up to a super wide angle, I found that the angle they chose was actually very comfortable. No matter what I was doing, either playing this on my lap or on a desk or just kind of holding it up in my hands, there was never a moment where I thought to myself, I wish this was a little bit wider. And so when it comes to actually opening up to a wider angle, I found that I didn't really need it anyway. And I appreciate that you can put it to a less wide angle. So for example, if you wanted to prop this up on your desk and then stream maybe Netflix on it, this would work out really well. And one of the nicer things about using a clamshell like this is that you can play it laying down very comfortably. And that's because you can use optimal angles between both your hands and the screen to have the best of both worlds. And finally, when talking about the hinge, one other thing I was curious about was whether or not it would go to sleep when you close it. And sure enough, yes, this is the same as pressing the power button, it'll just turn the device directly to sleep. And depending on how quickly you open it after you've closed it, you may not have to actually press the power button to wake it back up. But if you wait more than say like 10 seconds, you will have to tap the power button once you do open it. Either way, I think that's a really handy feature, especially if you're going to be taking this one on the go. When you combine this with the fact that this is a very easy handheld to carry around, this kind of turns it into a more plug and play experience. And by the way, the battery life when it's in standby is pretty great too. I tested one of my devices last night in sleep mode over a period of 12 hours. And in those 12 hours, it only lost 5% of battery life altogether. So it's not a super sleep mode like on the PS Vita, but still that's pretty dang good. And so in wrapping up this section here, I think like a lot of other people, I was concerned about how this device felt in the hands. And that's because some of the marketing material made it look a little bit cheap and maybe something like a toy. And so while I do agree that yes, this does look a little bit cheap overall, once I actually had the Retroid Pocket Flip in my hand, I was pretty satisfied with it. It's not a gaming handheld that I would consider to be a luxury item, but all the same, I think it does exactly what a good clamshell is supposed to do. And that is that it protects the most important components of your device. And to me, whether or not the outside gets a little bit beat up along the way is neither here nor there. After all, that's what a clamshell is for. And in that regard, yes, the Retroid Pocket Flip does feel nice and rugged and pretty sturdy too. Although among all of them, I'm a little bit concerned about the Sport Red one right here getting scratched up over time. And that's a great segue to our next section. Another thing I learned about the Retroid Pocket Flip by virtue of having 3 different colors with me is that they vary greatly. And so while I usually don't give advice about which color you should buy, I do think your color choice really matters here when it comes to the Flip. And as a quick reminder, from left to right, the names of these are Sport Red, Watermelon, and Indigo. And like I mentioned earlier, the Sport Red one is the review unit that was sent to me. And the first thing you can see is this one is insanely glossy, way more than any other handheld that I own. And in addition to that glossiness, it's also a huge fingerprint magnet. And if you watched any of my other videos, you know this is like a pet peeve of mine. And so if this is a pet peeve of yours, you're probably not going to want to have the glossy texture right here. And I don't know, you might like that color factor. You might be someone who waxes their car every weekend. That's totally not me. But luckily, I'm self-aware enough to know that I wanted to buy something else. And so now let's take a look at that watermelon color, which really was my first pick overall. Part of that has to do with the fact that I love transparent devices, and I'm also happy to report that this one has a more matte texture to it. And I also like the contrast between the black and the red. It looks really good on the Sport Red too, but I especially like it here with the transparent model. Now, one thing I did notice is the coloring is not quite like the marketing materials. If you look at the render from their sale page, you can see that it's quite a bit more transparent here. And as a result, all of the black components underneath just look really nice in that contrast between the two. But unfortunately, in real life, you can see the watermelon model is more opaque. And that does give it a bit softer of a vibe overall, but all the same, I still think it looks pretty good and is definitely one of my top choices. And then up next, we have the Indigo. This one has a special place in my heart because it reminds me of a GameCube. This one also has a matte texture to it and does pick up on fingerprints a little bit more than the transparent model. But still, it's not anywhere as bad as on the Sport Red. What I do like about this one is it feels just a lot more muted. And a lot of that has to do with that softer purple color, but then also these light gray accents too. And I think it was smart that they didn't color the A, B, and XY buttons right here either. So in the end, between these 3, then definitely the Indigo and the Watermelon are my favorite 2 picks. And at least for now, between these 2 right here, I decided to work on the Watermelon one first. And so when you see a lot of my gameplay footage, you're going to see the Watermelon, and that's because this is the one I've been setting up. Now, hindsight's always 20/20, and I've kind of been eyeballing the 16-bit US color right here, and there's a couple reasons for that. Number one is this probably has a matte texture like the others, which means the hinge is going to give you more resistance, which I like. Additionally, because it has such a light color, it's probably not going to smudge and fingerprint as much either. And so knowing what I know now between all these different colors, I think this is probably the one I would have ordered. Either way, I hope these findings of mine actually help you if you are still on the fence about which color to buy. Okay, another concern I had about the Retroid Pocket Flip are the 2 analog sliders they have on the device. Now personally I have a bit of a mixed history when it comes to sliders. I first tried them on a PSP and I really hated them, but I didn't really mind them on a 3DS. And luckily the Retroid Pocket Flip sliders are very similar to those on the 3DS. In fact, these are a bit of an upgrade. For example, they have Hall sensors within them, which means that they will not develop drift over time. Additionally, these will actually click down for L3 and R3 like a lot of other analog sticks. And I was surprised to find that it takes quite a bit of force to press down on them. So I think it's going to be basically impossible to accidentally press down on L3 and R3 when you're playing. And overall, I think when you're just moving them around like this, it is a very fluid experience. And yeah, like I mentioned, it's very reminiscent of a Nintendo 3DS. And in direct comparison between the two, yes, it's a very similar experience. The main difference here is that the 3DS cap has a bit of a more rubbery, soft feel to it, and it's also a bit taller, like it sticks out more from the case. However, they both feel very nice and sturdy to me. And going into the Gamepad Tester app right here, you can see that they are insanely accurate. No matter where I want to go on this grid right here, I can reach it no problem. So we're getting a full range of motion right here, and it feels like I can push this wherever I need it to go. In fact, if I'm being honest, this feels a little bit more accurate than using like a Nintendo Switch Joy-Con. And I found that for the most part, when using this in gameplay, it's actually a pretty fun experience. For example, when playing an arcade game like this, yeah, I really enjoy it here. And the same goes when playing 3D games like something on Sega Saturn or Nintendo 64 or even Dreamcast. All these feel really good with the analog slider. In fact, sometimes when I had a choice between the D-pad and the analog slider, for example here with PSP, I ended up preferring to use the slider over the D-pad. And it's a little bit ironic given the fact that I would actively avoid it on the actual PSP. In the end, if you've tried sliders before and you didn't mind them, say for example on a 3DS, I definitely don't think you're going to mind them here on the Retroid Pocket Flip. However, if you already hate using analog sliders, this is not going to change your mind either. So there is no sort of magic juice within these Retroid sliders which are going to make that big difference. However, I did not enjoy myself when trying to use both analog sticks in something like a first-person shooter. And some of this has to do with my brain. For example, I'm an inverted player, so down is up and up is down, usually when I'm playing with 2 joysticks. But I found that with an analog slider, I did not like using inverted controls. And I think part of that is that my brain is associating this slider with like a mouse input. And so instead, when I need to look up, I want to move up like I would on a mouse. And so overall, the entire experience was like super confusing to me when I tried to play these games. And if I'm going to be honest, when trying to reach both of these analog sticks plus the triggers at the same time, it's a little bit unergonomic, which just so happens to be our next segment, so let's move on to that. Now, one of my major issues with clamshells is that they never really feel very ergonomic to me. So I did come into this segment with a pretty skeptical perspective. The triggers themselves have a soft clickiness to them, very similar to a Nintendo Switch or the other Retroid Pocket devices. However, I did find that these shoulders are a little bit thicker than they were before. These triggers are also new and unique. They are actually analog inputs for the first time ever with a Retroid product. And these are pretty good in the fact that they have a pretty wide range of motion to them, but I think they do have a little bit of a mushy feel to them. And it certainly feels better than other clamshell devices like the 3DS, which has these kind of inline shoulders and triggers. So I guess in the end I would give these maybe like a 7 out of 10. I love the form factor here, but in execution they do feel a little bit mushy. But the nice thing about having an analog input like this is that many games will support it. And that's going to come into play with some Dreamcast games and a lot of GameCube games too. And when it comes to streaming more modern games like Forza Horizon 5, this will be especially important. Because now you can fully play this game by pressing on the gas at a variable degree. So when it comes to playing racing games like this, yeah, I think it's actually a pretty ergonomic experience. But like I mentioned before, when trying to play dual analog sticks and also the triggers at the same time, yeah, it's a little bit awkward. And so while I think this will be a pretty good device when it comes to game streaming thanks to that 16:9 aspect ratio, I think I'm going to have to be pretty choosy about which games I actually play. Now moving forward, when it comes to just basic ergonomics like playing with the D-pad and the buttons, absolutely no problems here. Everything is very easy to press down on and reach. And having a larger form factor like this when the device is open does feel very comfortable. And while I do appreciate that they put the start and select buttons on the actual front of the device this time around, I did find they are a bit of a stretch to actually reach them. So if you wanted to close out of a game in RetroArch by pressing select and start, you do have to reach down pretty far to actually press them. Again, it's not the end of the world, these are buttons that you will not be pressing all the time, but all the same, we got a lot of open space on this device and I feel like they could have placed them somewhere better. Which, by the way, is the topic of our next section, which is the fact that the Retroid Pocket Flip has some pretty strange design choices. So let's go over the things that really left me scratching my head after my first day with the device. To start, let's go ahead and look at the back. In addition to the active fan that they've added, for some reason they've only put one speaker on this device, and it's this little black circle right here. And I simply don't understand why they did this in the first place. If we open up the device, you can see there's a ton of space right here in the center. And personally, I think that would have been a great place to put a speaker. Now in reality, they probably put it in the back because of some engineering issue, but all the same, when looking at it in hindsight, it just seems like a glaring omission. At the very least, I feel like they could have done something else with this space. If they're not going to put the select and start buttons right here, I think it would have been beneficial to put Android function buttons here, like a back and a home button. For example, when trying to exit out of this game right here, the only way I can do it is to actually reach up above the controller and swipe over from the left. And this does a couple things. Number one, it's going to put a bunch of fingerprints on my screen that don't need to be there, but then also I have to reach pretty far up in the game to actually swipe over. And as you start moving in and out of apps, it does get quite annoying. And so if I had a choice, I would have put a back and a home button here in that empty space. Another thing I don't really understand is the fact that they added a fan here in the first place. After all, this uses the same chip as the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, which does not need a fan. And so I'm going to turn on the performance one right here just to put it at max speed. And right away, the first thing I heard is that the fan itself is super audible. And I don't mean just like the wind blowing, but the actual mechanism inside. So with the fan in performance mode, I'm going to turn the device on and off again so you can hear it kick in and turn off. And yeah, to me this is quite annoying. In fact, I found it to be pretty loud when compared to the game audio. Here's an example of me playing at 75% volume and you can still clearly hear the fan. Now for the next part, I've turned the fan off, but I want to give you a feel of the audio quality as well. And to me, this sounds pretty darn muffled, especially when compared to actually flipping the device around and hearing it dead on. And to me, this is just another reason why they should have put that speaker on the front. Because overall, I think it's actually pretty good audio coming out of here. It's just a real shame that it's not actually facing the listener. Now, one more example here, I wanted to show that when you lay the device directly onto a table, you can still hear it pretty well. And this is likely because the trigger buttons stick out from the device, which leaves a bit of an air pocket here on the bottom. Now moving on, another choice I found to be pretty weird was the D-pad and face buttons. And these have a rubber membrane connection very similar to the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus. So they have that kind of classic feel. When you push down on them, they're a little bit mushy. And while I do appreciate that with many other handhelds, it doesn't make a lot of sense with a clamshell. Because in order to make these components stick out enough that they feel good, that means they have to be elevated quite a bit. And I feel like with a clamshell, you want to have everything as low profile as possible. And so while I think that the face buttons and D-pads themselves are pretty good when you press down on them, it's just an odd decision to not use something that has a little bit less travel requirement. For example, on the Retroid Pocket 3, they had the PS Vita style D-pad, which I really love, and this one has a much more shallow travel to it while still being very accurate. And same thing with the face buttons. These have a dome-style soft click to them, which means they have a low amount of travel to them but are very easy to press down on as well. And I think this combination would have been great inside of this clamshell. For example, let's take a look at that new Nintendo 3DS one more time. As you can see here, the D-pad and the face buttons are super shallow here. And they have a nice soft clickiness to them, which is very accurate but also very satisfying too. And because these controls are so shallow, that means that the device overall can be thinner. Because after all, the screen has less space that it actually needs to clear. And I think this is probably a factor in why the Nintendo 3DS is about 2/3 the thickness of the Retroid Pocket Flip. So when it comes down to it, I appreciate the fact that Retroid used some pretty nice components and they feel pretty good in the device, but they do feel like a bit of a mismatch from my expectations when using any other clamshell. And to me it's kind of strange, because they knocked it out of the park with the Retroid Pocket 3, so why didn't they just repeat that? Anyway, while I have you here, let's do a quick D-pad test just to give you a feel for the accuracy. When it comes to the Contra test, this is where I press down and then try to rock back and forth. You can see that the character basically doesn't move at all. This means it's very unlikely you're going to have accidental diagonals when playing a game like Contra. And of course, when actually playing Contra, I found that I'm still able to hit the diagonals no problem too. So in this regard, I do think this is a very accurate D-pad. It feels very good with platformers like this. And I found it's a similar story with precision platformers like Celeste. In this one, every time I wanted to hit a diagonal, I could, and every time I wanted to go straight, I did as well. In fact, I had a great time testing Celeste right here. It was a really unique experience to have a clamshell version of this particular game. And I think this combination of using the face buttons and D-pad, as well as the right shoulder button to grip onto the sides of the wall, was actually a really nice experience here when playing this game. And then finally, I wanted to test a D-pad style fighting game, so here's Street Fighter II Turbo on the Super Nintendo. It did take me a few minutes to get into the groove of the D-pad itself, but after that I could do dragon punches and fireballs and hurricane kicks with absolutely no problem. I wouldn't say it's 100% accuracy right here, but it's a good 95%. And I'm not like an expert fighting game guy or anything else like that, but it did feel pretty good. Okay, moving on, another thing I wanted to talk about is the fact that this device is just not a DS or a 3DS. And personally, I think that's okay. Now, there's no question about it. When trying to play a DS or 3DS game, it is going to be a compromised experience. After all, these games were designed to have two screens on top of each other. And not only that, the touchscreen is meant to be between the controls right here. So the closest we can get to this configuration is to have a side-by-side like this. However, when you need to actually tap on the game, you have to move your hand off from the controller and then all the way up onto the screen. And that can be quite distracting and is pretty far from what the original developers intended when they built these games. Now, there are some workarounds. For example, I've mapped my shoulder buttons to be able to toggle between the screens. And depending on the game, that might give me a pretty nice experience. For example, with this game here, you really only need to see one screen at a time, and so you'll be able to play these games with a bigger screen and in a nice high definition too. But all the same, if you want to play DS games like they were originally intended, you're much better off using a Nintendo DS or a 3DS. And it's a similar story with the 3DS. In addition to having that kind of side-by-side setup, the chip within the Retroid Pocket Flip is really not powerful enough to be able to play all these games at full speed. Now, there is a silver lining in that the Citra team is working on a Vulkan graphic backend for the Android version of their app. However, that app is not publicly available just yet, and so it's going to be some time. But even then, I still don't think this is going to be an ideal device to play 3DS games on. Instead, I found it to be a very unique experience when playing all the other games that aren't the DS or the 3DS. For example, this is kind of like a high-definition Game Boy Advance SP. Not only can you play these games in a larger screen than was ever originally available, but they scale really well and look super good on this screen, which is nice and saturated too. And same goes with systems like PSP. This one will blow up the entire 16:9 screen, and you can play things at a 2 or a 3x resolution. So it's basically like playing a remastered PSP, but in a clamshell form factor that we never had. And it's also kind of neat to play a clamshell version of other systems like Sega Saturn or Nintendo 64. And another benefit that I noticed that I didn't really think about before is that playing 4x3 content on here doesn't really bother me at all. Generally, when trying to play these games on a 16:9 screen, I always look at those black borders on the sides. But because the screen is above the controls, I don't really focus on it at all. And so when playing 4x3 games like this, it's actually pretty nice. And of course, if you want to push the hardware, there are some PS2 and GameCube games you can play. And like I've showed in other videos, not every single game's going to play, but when they do, it's a pretty fun experience. The idea of having a pocketable clamshell PS2 or GameCube, even with a limited library, is still pretty awesome. And I should mention that the Retroid Pocket Flip is running a new version of their firmware, and this had a pretty significant performance boost from their previous version. In fact, there was an over-the-air update for the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus that brought this same firmware to it. And as soon as I'm done making this video here, that's what I'm going to work on next. So be on the lookout for my next video, which is going to be a comparison of the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus firmware between the old one and the new. Because the performance difference here is pretty significant, especially with GameCube. For example, here with Super Mario Sunshine, all I've done is just boot this game up with the default settings in Dolphin MMJR. And as you can see, it's playing at full speed, even in Delfino Plaza, which is usually harder to run. And finally, the other thing that just really tickled me pink was the idea of being able to play some Nintendo Switch games on this device in a clamshell form factor. I really enjoyed the idea of playing Celeste or something like SteamWorld Dig 2 like this. Now, the library of games that can actually play on the Retroid Pocket Flip is going to be pretty narrow, but all the same, there's a good dozen or more games that can play at full speed. And I'll cover this more in detail when I actually get to my in-depth review sometime in the next week or so. And so in wrapping things up here in what has to be the longest quick impressions video ever made, I found that the Retroid Pocket Flip has actually been winning me over. And it's kind of a strange thing to admit given the fact that I have publicly stated many times that I'm not really a clamshell guy. And honestly, I really don't know what it is about the Retroid Pocket Flip that just seems so appealing to me. Maybe it's the fact that this is really just a different version of the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus. And that's a device I love. In fact, that's the one that I usually recommend to most people when they ask me what device they should buy. And even though the Retroid Pocket Flip has has its share of flaws and is really made for a very niche use case, I found that I've settled into that very easily. I love the idea of being able to open up this device and have a wider and more luxurious playing experience, and then I can just snap it shut and it's super easy to carry around as well. In the end, this is the way I see it. I bought 2 of these Retroid Pocket Flip devices and had another review unit sent to me, and when I made that purchase, I really didn't have a lot of interest in the device in the first place. And I remember thinking to myself, man, if I didn't have a channel, I probably wouldn't be buying these devices in the first place. And yet here I am 24 hours later, loving the crap out of my Retroid Pocket Flip devices and trying to decide which one I'm actually going to play the most on. And so if I had the ability to go into a different timeline of the Retro Game Core multiverse, and I could find a different version of Russ from Retro Game Core who never made a channel in the first place, and if that guy was on the fence about whether or not to buy one of these devices, I would look him straight in the eye and say, yeah man, you need to do it. Because when it comes down to it, I'm really enjoying this device. And everyone in my family has been pretty excited to check it out as well. And that doesn't usually happen with a lot of the handhelds that come into the house. And so for me, I can easily say that yes, I'm happy that I bought these devices. But whether or not I can recommend that you buy one, I think that's going to take a little bit more time. So if you're not already, I would say hit that subscribe button, because in about a week or so, I'm going to come out with a final in-depth review. And in that one, I'll talk more about whether or not this device particularly is going to be a good fit for you and your use case. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.